I just tell the truth, and telling the truth is crazy in a world full of lies.
Hello guys, welcome to the Meal Press, a time capsule for anything Bible related. We just finished last week our series on the book of Esther. After 12 weeks, we were able to break down each individual chapter in the book of Esther and relate it right back to Jesus. However, amidst the whole 12 weeks, the constant questions you guys brought up was in reference to marriage and dating. We then release our modern episodes every other Monday discussing dating, marriage, and feminism in an attempt to answer your questions, but still you guys wanted a little bit of a further breakdown. After some time praying and considering what should be next, we finally have decided to go to our new series opening and starting today, Covenant, where two become one. This is going to be a series where we're going to break down the biblical model of marriage, divorce, and covenant to understand its intent, the purpose, the having of all these three things: marriage, divorce, and covenant. The inner workings of marriage, the justification, repercussions of divorce, the complexity that comes with joining your life with someone else. This is where we're going to discuss our new series, Covenant. Now, if you have been following, you know I'm very big about the numbers, the statistics. What is the truth of what is going on today? So I figure we start with some numbers so that way you guys can grab a bit of a grasp on what it is that we're dealing with today in today's society. 41 to 50% of marriages do end up in divorce, and yet 2/3 of those people that divorce go on to remarry yet again. Surprisingly, when you remarry, your divorce rate goes up to 60%. And if you happen to, again, divorce from that second marriage onto a third, the divorce rate goes up to 73%. It seems like changing and adding and divorcing and marrying again is not the solution. It's just a higher risk of you guys just divorcing. Nonetheless, all this information has been provided by the Institute of Family Studies. Now, you may be telling me, okay, Ariel, that may be all fine and well, but that doesn't apply to me. I am looking to get married. I'm looking forward to get married. You're right, because according to the Pew Research Center, they conducted a study where they took age group 18 to 34-year-olds, and they discovered that a solid, staggering 69% of people wanted to get married someday. However, they are delaying that which they desire because of one thing. They are prioritizing higher education, higher salary. Basically, they want to be more economically stable, which is valid, right? Because right now in this society, because of inflation, because of everything that's going on, it is expensive to maintain your cost of living. So it does make sense that you want to now pursue a higher education so that you can have the wedding of your dreams, the marriage of your dreams, what it is that you want to actually pursue. The one problem we have with that is when you look at a divorce, 76% of divorces are initiated by women, and of the 76%, 94% of those women are those with higher education. So now I did release an episode, Modern Independence and Dating, where I discussed the correlation between higher education and divorce, that this institution seems to be teaching something that is opposite to what we consider marriage. I will hope you guys listen to it because I don't want to really get back into that same study yet again. But I will say I am all for a woman pursuing higher education. I'm more concerned about the intent as to why you are pursuing this, right? Jordan Peterson addresses in his book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos, where he disclosed that 80% of women usually pursue a field in healthcare, public administration, psychology, and or education. And then says, and I quote, "This is not good news for women, since women in higher education are finding it increasingly difficult to maintain a relationship of moderate duration, and in consequence are more inclined to hook up and have sequential hookups." What Jordan is telling us is that there seems to be a correlation with you prioritizing higher education, your success, and your inability to maintain a relationship because of that success. So then where do we go from here? It seems like 68% of us today want to get married. And yet it seems like there's a solid percentage of people that end up getting divorced. And going into school and pursuing a higher education just increases those odds. So Ariel, how can we escape this corrupt generation? And this is why we are going to dive into marriage. We're going to dive into the breakdown that God gives us of marriage, a biblical model of what marriage is, starting with this episode, which I titled Covenant in the Beginning. Now, I do say this generation, but let me tell you, marriage, divorce, separating, single moms, all of these things have been going on for thousands of years. It is just the human condition. Even Jesus, if you look into Matthew chapter 19, right, you see that Jesus was walking, and then Pharisees, these are teachers, right, teachers of the law. They came up to him and asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? And Jesus responds this way. He says, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And then they go to ask him, so then why did Moses give us a certificate of divorce and allow us to send our now ex-wives away? And Jesus says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not like this from the beginning. And when I read that, it made me realize that Jesus is pointing to the fact that marriage was different in the beginning than that which came after the beginning. And after I started just further in that study and breaking those things down, I realized this. Not every marriage is covenant, but every marriage under God is for covenant. And that's very tricky, because if you go to most churches, they'll say marriage is covenant. And honestly, when you look at what Jesus is saying, he's saying there's a distinction between marriage at the beginning and marriage after the law. So we're going to dive into what is the distinction. And just like Jesus says, we have to go back to the beginning. So let's do that and go all the way back to Genesis. Everyone that has ever read the Bible usually starts in Genesis chapter 1. So I think most people have read, or anybody that has tried to read the Bible, they always start in the book of Genesis. So I will give you guys just a quick bullet point recap of each chapter, 1, 2, 3, and 4, until we get into breaking down the word and the concept of marriage. Now, in chapter 1 of Genesis, you have the creation of the world, right? Chapter 2 of Genesis, you have the creation of humanity, Adam and Eve. And in chapter 3, you have the fall, where sin and death entered the world, and Adam and Eve and humanity was kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And then you finally get to chapter 4. And chapter 4 is the first time you see the words marriage and wife. So I want to break this down, because since this is the first time we see marriage, I want you to keep in mind this is right after the fall. This is the second generation that came after the fall, after the kids of Adam and Eve, right? And I want to break this down, and I want to make sure you understand this is the concept of marriage came after the fall in this perspective, because marriage is first mentioned to be a legal standard that was first introduced by the son of Adam named Cain. And then what we're going to do is we're going to break down his character in relation to the marriage that he set forward with his wife. Chapter 4 starts very strangely, right? Because we're talking about marriage, but when you look at chapter 4, you have Cain and Abel, right? Adam and Eve's first and second born son. And it starts with them bringing an offering unto God. And then when you read the text, it says that the offering that came from Abel was looked on favorably, whereas the one that came from Cain was not looked upon with favor. Now, I'll stop there, because let me tell you, I read that, and the first thing that came to my mind is the ongoing battle that we constantly see on the gram, which is, what do you bring to the table? That is now the standard of dating, right? What do you bring to the table? Because now we have reduced marriage to this legal capacity of like, what is the asset and the value that you bring economically to this relationship? Let's put it all down so we can see, do we have enough for me to sign up with this contract? I say all of that to say, when you look at marriage from the point of view of God, a man is a provider. And I say that because as a provider, it is on you to provide the house, the table, what goes on the table, everything that has to do with the table itself. Women are not called to be providers. And I want you to understand that, because especially nowadays with the rise of feminism and women independence, that is a key concept that has been taken away. And now you have this whole concept of like financial asset understanding of what you bring to the table. I will say this, when you look into the offering that Cain and Abel brought forward, is not necessarily about their offering, but it's about the position and what the offering exposes their hearts to be. The Bible says that God loves a cheerful giver, right? That God looks at the heart, not the outward appearances. So everything that has to do with what you offer has to do with what is inside your heart. So therefore, when a provider provides, this is coming from your heart. That's different, because a man that's a provider is not looking at a woman to provide, because what is in your heart is to give, right? So I say that, and some people consider this and they say, okay, so what do women bring to the table? Well, your character, right? That's what you bring to the table. It's not about what you bring to the table. It's who sits with you at the table. I will tell you this, the biggest asset a woman can bring is a good, loving, nurturing, pure character. And if you don't believe me, you just have to read Proverbs 31, because Proverbs 31 starts with a wife of noble character who can find, right? And it says that she brings her husband good and not harm. And then you have to really sit there and consider, as far as your marriage is concerned, do you bring goodness to your husband, or do you bring him harm with the words and the things that you share against them? What kind of offering are you giving to your spouse? Because the heart of a provider provides out of his heart with love. So the heart of the receiver should then match that gratitude. And again, gratitude is all about character. What is in your heart? What is the offering that you bring into your husband? Because you read Proverbs 31, it says her husband has full confidence in her. She brings him good, not harm. You have to look, what is the nature of your heart? Because even with Cain and Abel, the very chapter that has to do with marriage, the first thing that you see is, what offering are you bringing? It's not what you bring into the table. It's what is the condition of your heart, your intent, your desire for this marriage, for this relationship. On to me. This is why it's like when we look back in the old days, what is your intention with my daughter, right? But let's keep breaking down the character of Cain, who first introduced the idea, the concept of marriage, right? You go on to read the story and you see that Cain gets angry and begins to roleplay a scenario because his brother's offering was accepted, right? And God tells him, if you do what is right, you will be accepted. But sin is crouching at your door and it desires to have you. That's verse 7. Cain ignores it in a field, and in a field he kills his brother and buries him under the ground, trying to hide the body. And God comes around and says, where's your brother? And he responds, am I my brother's keeper? And that's verse 9. And let me tell you something, I read that, right? And I love that, because when you see what is happening, Cain is getting angry because his offering is not being looked upon with favor. But then he doesn't say, oh, he's upset because his offering wasn't looked upon with favor. God responds and tells him, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Now you're offering you. Why does he say that? Because the very things that we give out is a representation of our character. And this is what I'm saying, that God is trying to look at your heart. Same way that as a spouse, you're going to look at your wife's heart and see, like, what is your intention? It's very different for a person to cook you a meal with hatred and anger than someone that cooks you a meal lovingly. that intention, it could be a meal nonetheless. It could be a marriage nonetheless. But your intention says everything. But from Cain's response, you see, like, am I my brother's keeper? He says that. Let me tell you another character trait that you got to look for when you're going for a partner. Look at the way he treats his family. Because how they treat their family, the closest blood relative to them, should be a sign for you to know how they will treat you. Listen, it's really difficult for someone to be able to love you when they never seen love, right? When they never practice love, right? For them to never practice provision, even for their own families, taking care of their room, taking care of their house, helping their families out. Like, it's visible. You have to see the character, because like Cain, if you don't see, like, again, am I my brother's keeper? If you don't see the same likeness of a provider, why would you go after this? I was talking to a friend of mine and I told him, a single mother cannot teach you how to be a loving wife, right? Because you cannot learn from someone who hasn't experienced and practiced it a right way to experience and practice it yourself. That's like saying, I'm going to learn how to play soccer from a basketball player. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah, they're both the same sport. Yeah, they both have a ball. They both have a goal. You still have players, but nonetheless, completely different rules. And unless you play the game and practice and train and win, you cannot counsel in that ideology, which is why the Bible is so important, because even if you're lacking that picture, man, when I tell you, like, the picture of the Bible is God showing you how he wants to be one with you. And he says he wants to make a covenant, a marriage with you, that he will be with you. Even when your mother and your father forsake you, he's there. If you want to learn about provider, look at the provider. If you want to learn about love, look at the one that loves. Like God and has shown us the actual standard, so that even when you don't have, you still have a way to achieve it, right? You still have an example. But this is why I mentioned, like, because when you consider the concept of, like, man, it's really hard for you to show something you never experienced or practice something that you never been taught. It makes me think of, like, this whole idea, the normalized movement. Because when you consider the normalize this because X, Y, and Z, right? When you consider that movement, you notice it's very revealing to their life story. It's their perception. It's their perception based on the life that they have lived. Like, for example, if I say normalize having rest, it should provoke a thought in you saying, like, you live in a world where rest is not normal. And therefore you want to normalize what you do not possess. Right? People that say normalize intimacy because you've been used like a puppet, going from relationship to relationship and never having any intimacy. And you think that's normal. You say, no, can we make this normal? And the fact is that it is. It's just not within your circle, right? You see the same thing, normalize going on dates. Because again, you may be used to having hookups and people don't take you as serious. And the thing that you want to normalize, it's a reflection of the standard that you have been shown here in your life. That's what I'm saying. The standard of a single mother cannot teach you how the standard of a married, loving wife. You cannot adequately teach what you don't practice. But I love that, because in the story of Cain, you see that God exposes him and says he can hear the blood of Abel from under the ground. And it then says that Cain is cursed. And it's from this curse that we're going to break down marriage, because this is where you see the first practice and the first revelation of what marriage was to Cain. God tells Cain, when you work the ground, it will not yield fruit. And now, before I continue, I just want to explain, this doesn't mean that he wasn't successful. It doesn't mean that he didn't have money. If you keep reading, it says he went on to build a city, right? That's not the type of fruit that he's mentioning here, because, back in those days, everything was agriculture. They're not referring to the fruit of agriculture or harvesting or none of that. You see, success and provision are not the same thing, and just because you may have success doesn't mean that you have provision. And I want to just kind of like put a little pin on that because we're going to talk about the fruit of marriage later on. But nonetheless, I want you to focus on the character of Cain, because Cain gets to become very successful. But again, it does not yield any fruit, right? So I was explaining to somebody like this. It's not the same thing being a provider and having a lot of money, right? And I gave them this simple analogy. I said, imagine a man that makes $100,000 a year, takes you on a date that's worth $1,000, and you have a great time, the best time, right? Now, suppose another man that only makes $25,000 a year takes you to the same exact restaurant, $1,000 meal, and you have a great time, the best time. I will ask you, which is the greater provider in that sense, right? Because you would think, the person that has $100,000, clearly he has more capacity to provide. Nonetheless, imagine when I tell you that it's the one that makes $25,000 that's a greater provider. Why? Because the one that makes $25,000 a year takes greater care, harder discipline, more practice, and patience to plan out a date that's worth $1,000. And I want you to understand the sacrifice, it's greater from the smaller amount that he has. On top of that, the level of planning to be able to afford a meal worth $1,000 takes a lot more practice, a lot more patience, a lot more fulfilling day after day, work after work, to a common goal. So I say all of that to say is that the way that we go about rating provision is not about how much money you have, but how well can you manage the money that you do have. And that has been probably one of the greatest things that I have learned throughout ministry, that like Jesus says, if you are faithful with little, you will be blessed with much. And that's a key concept, because if you're going again into a marriage and you're not bringing an offering, you're bringing a list of things and demands. You need to have a six-figure salary. You need to be X, Y, and Z. Listen, that is not an offering. You are going there with the wrong motives. But let's continue. Let's break down the character of Cain, because it says you will be restless wanderer. And let me tell you something. When you read those words, it's supposed to give you two ideas. One, a man can rest in his woman. Understand that. And you see now this man is restless and he wanders. Why do I bring that up? It's because if you do not have the stability of a home, it's really hard for you to build it. You need an example. And if you always wandering around, hitting the streets like day after day, it's going to be very difficult for you to understand what marriage is, because marriage is a foundation, and a foundation is stable and it stays in place. That's why when you read the book of Isaiah, chapter 2, chapter 3, it talks about, honestly, being out in the streets. What does it look like when you out in the streets? I'm not going to tell you what it says, but I would love for you to read it, right? Let's get back to Cain, right? It says you'll be driven away from the land and away from God's presence. And let me tell you something, that broke my heart, because understand the land is the blessing, right? This is your inheritance. It's saying that you have forfeited the things that are in your land, your father's household. And who is Cain's father? Adam, the man that walked and talked with God. Who else can give you better advice about life? But when it says that you were driven from the land, you're saying, I'm leaving my family values and I'm going to go ahead and do my thing. That you see, Cain is separating from everything that's God-like and going on his own way. He's leaving the home and becoming a wanderer. He's leaving the provision of his father and being restless. He is now working the land, right? But he's not yielding fruit. He's just yielding success, right? And this is why I'm very big, and honestly somewhat oppose women independence when this is the area that they kind of going into. Right? Independence away, because what I see from women is a restlessness, a tiredness, and I genuinely feel bad. I don't see it as competition. For me, I see it as a man that is supposed to provide. I see a woman working tirelessly And that breaks me because I know that there's a man that should have been providing for her to keep her from this tired state. Nonetheless, that's just my opinion. That's not God's opinion, but nonetheless, I do want to share that because, again, if men are supposed to be a provider and a woman is supposed to be the receptor of that provider, the one that receives it, then when you work, what are you doing? You're taking the place of a man, tiring yourself out, and you are never meant to do that. Again, we cover these things in the episode of Modern, but more than that, he went away from God's presence. And that's huge because it's only then, after these curses, that you see that he made love to his wife and he had a son. And 5 generations later, you see his great-great-great-grandson, Lamech, ends up marrying not 1, but 2 wives. Now here, in Genesis 4:19, that's the first time we see the word marriage. And it's in relation to Lamech marrying 2 women, right? Lamech, a descendant of Cain. And now, I will tell you right off the bat, this is not God's intention. Remember what Jesus says, the 2 will become 1. He doesn't say the 3 and the 4 will become 1. He says the 2 will become 1. So why am I pointing that out? It's because I want you to see and understand that the word marriage is first used by a descendant of Cain and is used in relation to him marrying 2 women. Whereas when Jesus says it was not this way in the beginning, he says the 2 men and women will become 1. So you already see this quote unquote marriage that we have from Cain is not the marriage that God is talking about. This marriage that Cain is bringing up, it is nowhere near God's intention for marriage. Right? And I say that because when you look into the Hebrew word for marriage, it is the word wayika, right? Which basically means to take, right? It's the same concept of you taking possession or something that this belongs to me and you grab it. Why do I bring that up? Because when you go back and you go back to verse 7, remember when sin was crouching at the door, right? To Cain, and what did it say? It desires to have you. And now you see the same concept of taking, that sin wants to grab and take you. And now you see Cain being grabbed onto by that sin, and now that sin begins to flourish. And you're going to say, Ade, what are you talking about? Well, you got to look at the Bible as a full context, right? Because if you look in the book of James, in chapter 1, he says, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when full grown, gives birth to death. So what James is telling us is that, hey, there is a desire to sin, an evil desire to sin within you. And when you entertain that, it begins to mold and grow within you, and it turns into an action that brings forth death. And death basically is the consequence of sin. Why am I bringing that up? Because you see that sin was crouching at Cain. And again, this sin is not like it's this thing outside the door. It's something within himself. And that sin, as a thought, begins to grow, whether it be infidelity, whether it be discontent, whether it be looking at your husband and you're not interested no more. Maybe you don't respect him as much. Maybe he doesn't give you enough attention. Maybe he doesn't love you enough. Maybe somebody else gives you more attention. Maybe someone else is better looking. Maybe someone else has more money, or maybe a better lifestyle, or maybe just understands you better. Maybe. Right? But it says that when this desire, this thought begins to grow, it conceives sin. And then that desire begins to now go ahead and grow in you, and it causes you eventually to sin and bring it out into action. Why am I saying all of this? Because when you see Cain had sin dwelled up inside of him, entertained it, and even killed his brother. And now in that character, in that sinful state of being, in that evil mentality, that's when he goes, makes love to his wife, brings forth a kid, that kid brings forth another kid, and now the teachings of these generations have been passed down, that by the time you get to the 5th generation, Lamech, you see him in his full corruption marrying 2 women, completely opposite from everything that he had in his father's household, Adam. So, what am I saying to all of this? Marriage begins with the person, with their character, with the heart that they bring into the relationship. This is what Jesus was telling us. It was not like this in the beginning, because in the beginning, our hearts were not corrupt. In the beginning, we did not have evil desires. But then when sin entered the world, now your marriage is going to have constant ideas, constant friction. There are going to be desires in you that are not honorable to your spouse that will bring up within you so that you can go ahead and entertain it. And if you entertain it, it gives birth to death. And that death is the death of your marriage. This is not what God wants. So I want you to understand, and I want you to take this into perspective. There is no sin that can overshadow the power of Jesus on the cross. There is no desire in you that cannot be overcome by the power of the Holy Spirit. So if there's one thing I will advise you in this first episode, in the beginning, I will say, go back to the beginning. Who first loved you? God. Who formed you in the mother's womb even before you were born, who has loved you with an everlasting love, who has shown you compassion, grace, and love beyond any other man? God. So let the love of God manifested in his Son, Jesus Christ, dwell within you to rid you of the desires that attack your marriage. If you do not bring your husband good, but you do bring him harm, repent. If you bring your wife anything more than provision of love, provision of intimacy, provision of care, provision of finances, and you let her know, everything that I have is for you, just as everything that the Lord has, he has given unto me. Be a picture of Jesus. I'm telling you, this is how it was in the beginning. And next chapter, we're going to break down just the wisdom of marriage in chapter 5. And we're going to see just what does it look like when you put God in a marriage? What does it look like when you put God in the center of your marriage? How do you go ahead and proceed? Because from Cain, we saw that marriage was used as a taking. You're not going to find the word marriage in chapter 5. Why do you think that is? I'm going to show you exactly what God has for his church, for his people, so that your marriage will be able to yield fruit that the marriage of Cain could never yield. I'm going to show you how God exposes the beautiful aspect of what covenant is, even amidst a fallen world. So I hope you guys enjoy our first episode of our series Covenant. It has been an amazing journey, and I'll see you guys again this Thursday, 9 p.m. for Covenant and the wisdom of marriage. Take care.